Chapter 13 of The Way We Live Now. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 13. The Longestaffes. Mr. Adolphus Longestaffe, the Squire of Caversham in Suffolk, and of Pickering Park in Sussex, was closeted on a certain morning for the best part of an hour with Mr. Melmotte in Abchurch Lane, had there discussed all his private affairs, and was about to leave the room with a very dissatisfied air. There are men, and old men too, who ought to know the world, who think that if they can only find the proper Medea to boil the cauldron for them, they can have their ruined fortunes so cooked that they shall come out of the pot fresh and new and unembarrassed. These great conjurers are generally sought for in the city, and in truth the cauldrons are kept boiling, though the result of the process is seldom absolute rejuvenescence. No greater Medea than Mr. Melmotte had ever been potent in money matters, and Mr. Longestaffe had been taught to believe that if he could get the necromancer even to look at his affairs, everything would be made right for him. But the necromancer had explained to the squire that property could not be created by the waving of any wand or the boiling of any cauldron. He, Mr. Melmotte, could put Mr. Longestaffe in the way of realizing property without delay, of changing it from one shape into another, or could find out the real market value of the property in question, but he could create nothing. "You have only a life interest, Mr. Longestaffe." "No, only a life interest. That is customary with family estates in this country, Mr. Melmotte." "Just so. And therefore you can dispose of nothing else. Your son, of course, could join you, and then you could sell either one estate or the other." "There is no question of selling Caversham, sir. Lady Pomona and I reside there." "Your son will not join you in selling the other place?" "I have not directly asked him, but he never does do anything that I wish. I suppose you would not take Pickering Park on a lease for my life?" "I think not, Mr. Longestaffe. My wife would not like the uncertainty." Then Mr. Longestaffe took his leave with a feeling of outraged aristocratic pride. His own lawyer would almost have done as much for him, and he need not have invited his own lawyer as a guest to Caversham, and certainly not his own lawyer's wife and daughter. He had, indeed, succeeded in borrowing a few £1,000s from the great man, at a rate of interest which the great man's head clerk was to arrange, and this had been effected simply on the security of the lease of a house in town. There had been an ease in this, an absence of that delay which generally took place between the expression of his desire for money and the acquisition of it, and this had gratified him. But he was already beginning to think that he might pay too dearly for that gratification. At the present moment, too, Mr. Melmotte was odious to him for another reason. He had condescended to ask Mr. Melmotte to make him a director of the South Central Pacific and Mexican Railway, and he, Adolphus Longestaffe of Caversham, had had his request refused. Mr. Longestaffe had condescended very low. "You have made Lord Alfred Grendall one," he had said in a complaining tone. Then Mr. Melmotte explained that Lord Alfred possessed peculiar aptitudes for the position. "I'm sure I could do anything that he does," said Mr. Longestaffe. Upon this Mr. Melmotte, knitting his brows and speaking with some roughness, replied that the number of directors required was completed. Since he had had 2 duchesses at his house, Mr. Melmotte was beginning to feel that he was entitled to bully any mere commoner, especially a commoner who could ask him for a seat at his board. Mr. Longestaffe was a tall, heavy man, about 50, with hair and whiskers carefully dyed, whose clothes were made with great care, though they always seemed to fit him too tightly, and who thought very much of his personal appearance. It was not that he considered himself handsome, but that he was specially proud of his aristocratic bearing. He entertained an idea that all who understood the matter would perceive at a single glance that he was a gentleman of the first water and a man of fashion. He was intensely proud of his position in life, thinking himself to be immensely superior to all those who earned their bread. There were, no doubt, gentlemen of different degrees, but the English gentleman of gentlemen was he who had land, and family title deeds, and an old family place, and family portraits, and family embarrassments, and a family absence of any usual employment. He was beginning even to look down upon peers, since so many men of much less consequence than himself had been made lords; and having stood and been beaten 3 or 4 times for his county, he was of opinion that a seat in the House was rather a mark of bad breeding. He was a silly man who had no fixed idea that it behoved him to be of use to any one, but yet he had compassed a certain nobility of feeling. There was very little that his position called upon him to do, but there was much that it forbade him to do. It was not allowed to him to be close in money matters. He could leave his tradesmen's bills unpaid till the men were clamorous, but he could not question the items in their accounts. He could be tyrannical to his servants, but he could not make inquiry as to the consumption of his wines in the servants' hall. He had no pity for his tenants in regard to game, but he hesitated much as to raising their rent. He had his theory of life, and endeavoured to live up to it, but the attempt had hardly brought satisfaction to himself or to his family. At the present moment it was the great desire of his heart to sell the smaller of his 2 properties and disembarrass the other. The debt had not been altogether of his own making, and the arrangement would, he believed, serve his whole family as well as himself. It would also serve his son, who was blessed with a 3rd property of his own, which he had already managed to burden with debt. The father could not bear to be refused, and he feared that his son would decline. "But Adolphus wants money as much as any one," Lady Pomona had said. He had shaken his head and pished and pshawed. Women never could understand anything about money. Now he walked down sadly from Mr. Melmotte's office, and was taken in his brougham to his lawyer's chambers in Lincoln's Inn. Even for the accommodation of those few £1,000 he was forced to condescend to tell his lawyers that the title deeds of his house in town must be given up. Mr. Longestaffe felt that the world in general was very hard on him. "What on earth are we to do with them?" said Sophia, the eldest Miss Longestaffe, to her mother. "I do think it's a shame of papa," said Georgiana, the second daughter. "I certainly shan't trouble myself to entertain them." "Of course you will leave them all on my hands," said Lady Pomona wearily. "But what's the use of having them?" urged Sophia. "I can understand going to a crush at their house in town when everybody else goes. One doesn't speak to them, and need not know them afterwards. As to the girl, I'm sure I shouldn't remember her if I were to see her." "It would be a fine thing if Adolphus would marry her," said Lady Pomona. "Dolly will never marry anybody," said Georgiana. "The idea of his taking the trouble of asking a girl to have him! Besides, he won't come down to Caversham. Cart ropes wouldn't bring him. If that is to be the game, mamma, it is quite hopeless." "Why should Dolly marry such a creature as that?" asked Sophia. "Because everybody wants money," said Lady Pomona. "I'm sure I don't know what your papa is to do, or how it is that there never is any money for anything. I don't spend it." "I don't think that we do anything out of the way," said Sophia. "I haven't the slightest idea what papa's income is, but if we're to live at all, I don't know how we are to make a change." "It's always been like this ever since I can remember," said Georgiana, "and I don't mean to worry about it any more. I suppose it's just the same with other people, only one doesn't know it." "But, my dears, when we are obliged to have such people as these Melmottes—" "As for that, if we didn't have them, somebody else would. I shan't trouble myself about them. I suppose it will only be for 2 days."